You think you know the story of Meghan Markle and the royal family. You've read the headlines. You've seen the interviews. You've heard the commentary. But what if everything you believed was only half the story? What if the truth, the part no one dares to say aloud, was far darker, far more complicated, and far more manipulative than anyone could have imagined? That's exactly what Paul Burrell claims. And when he speaks, people in the royal circle listen, because he isn't just any commentator. He was Princess Diana's most trusted aide. He saw the inner workings of the palace. He witnessed Diana's fears firsthand, and he carries the knowledge of the private struggles that shaped a family in the public eye. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Paul Burrell once warned that Diana had a way of seeing the patterns of people before anyone else. She had instincts. She had insights that left even those closest to her in awe. And according to Burrell, Diana spoke of women who wielded charm like a weapon, who masked control in the guise of tragedy, and who used love as leverage to bend powerful men to their will. She warned that some would appear angelic, irresistible even, but behind the polished smile and sparkling eyes lurked someone with a precise agenda. She warned that these women could isolate, manipulate, and fracture the closest bonds a man had, even the bonds of brothers. And then Meghan came along. Burrell says he saw it unfold with Harry, the young prince who grew up in Diana's shadow, a man known for his warmth, his humor, and his unwavering loyalty to those he loved. He was smitten, yes, but he was also vulnerable. Paul witnessed the subtle shifts, the changes in behavior, the quiet isolation, the slow distancing from friends and family. To the public, it looked like a fairy tale romance. To Paul, it looked like a pattern Diana herself would have recognized. Think about that for a moment. The woman Harry believed was his partner, his confidant, the person he would trust above all others, might have been playing a careful, deliberate game, and he was only just noticing it. Meanwhile, William, Harry's brother and lifelong companion, saw the changes from the outside. The smiles in public did not match the tension behind closed doors. William saw the wedge forming. He saw the isolation. He felt the pull between loyalty to his brother and concern for the family. And according to Burrell, it all fit the very warning Diana had given. So what does this mean for Harry, William, and the royal family at large? What does it mean for the public, who has watched, fascinated and confused, as one of the most talked about couples in the world made their choices? And most importantly, what does it mean about Meghan herself? A woman who the world sees as poised, polished, and poised for public admiration, but whom Paul Burrell claims harbored a far more complex and calculated agenda. From the first day Harry met Meghan, Paul began to notice patterns. Small, almost imperceptible things at first. The way conversations shifted subtly to place Harry in a protective, reactive role. The way narratives were controlled, carefully shaped, and strategically shared with the press. The subtle isolation of Harry from those he trusted most. And most concerning, the tension between Harry and William that, according to Paul, Meghan seemed to exploit, knowingly or unknowingly. You might be thinking, could this really be true? Could a person truly charm, manipulate, and alter the course of royal lives without anyone noticing until it was too late? Paul Burrell says yes, and he claims he has proof, not just speculation. His observations are drawn from years of experience, intimate knowledge of palace dynamics, and direct interaction with both Diana and the princes. Let's pause for a moment and consider Diana's perspective. She was a woman who knew the sting of public scrutiny, who understood how easily private pain could be exploited. She had seen men fall for charm, manipulation, and carefully curated appearances before. She had lived it herself. And she had warned Paul, specifically, to watch for women who would use tragedy and empathy as tools to gain control, women who could cloak manipulation in warmth and vulnerability. The parallels, according to Burrell, were striking. Meghan arrived with charisma, with fame, with the ability to capture attention effortlessly. She understood the media, the optics, and the influence that came from public perception. Harry, sheltered in some ways by royal life, but deeply devoted and trusting, fell for it, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to drift from the people and structures that had defined him. William noticed. The palace noticed. Paul noticed. And Diana's warnings, once theoretical and cautious, suddenly seemed eerily prescient. This story isn't just about royal drama. It's about power, influence, and the subtle ways relationships can shift when one person knows how to wield emotional leverage. It's about trust broken quietly over time. It's about two brothers, connected by blood and loyalty, whose bond was tested in ways that no one outside the palace walls could fully understand. And it's about a revelation that Paul Burrell, a man who spent decades in the eye of the royal storm, felt compelled to share with the world. Here's the shocking part. What Paul reveals doesn't come from tabloids or speculation. It comes from private conversations, from observations he made while serving a woman whose life was defined by the tension between public image and private pain. He saw the tactics, the patterns, the slow reshaping of relationships. And he saw the impact: Harry's isolation, William's frustration, and the subtle, almost invisible ways Meghan's influence played out behind the scenes. But perhaps the most alarming aspect of all this is how it intersects with Diana's warnings. A woman who had lived through heartbreak, betrayal, and manipulation, who understood the vulnerabilities of the men she loved, had spoken of these very tactics years before Meghan even met Harry. And now, Paul Burrell is saying that those warnings were not only relevant, they were prophetic. You might ask yourself, if all of this is true, why didn't anyone stop it? Why didn't the palace intervene? Why didn't Harry recognize the warning signs earlier? And what does this mean for the royal family moving forward? These questions are not rhetorical. They are central to understanding the story Paul Burrell is telling, and they are what makes this revelation so explosive. In the next hour, you're going to hear a detailed account of Paul Burrell's perspective, his first-hand experiences, his private observations, and the moments that shocked him most. You'll see how a relationship that seemed idyllic to the outside world was, according to Burrell, fraught with manipulation, tension, and carefully orchestrated influence. You'll see how Diana's warnings echo through the corridors of the palace even now, and you'll confront the difficult question: when charm and tragedy are used as weapons, who is truly in control? Paul Burrell wasn't just a servant to Princess Diana. He was her confidant, her protector, and in many ways, her lifeline to the outside world. He knew her fears before anyone else. He saw her tears when the palace walls were too cold, and he heard her whispered anxieties in the dead of night. To the public, Diana was a glamorous figure, a princess in a fairy tale world. But behind the palace doors, her life was far more complicated, far more fragile, and far more human. And Paul Burrell was there for every moment. The triumphs, the heartbreaks, and the quiet, almost invisible struggles that no one else would ever see. Imagine walking through the halls of one of the most scrutinized households in the world, tasked with not only serving, but also protecting someone whose life was under constant observation. Every gesture, every word, every glance mattered. A misplaced comment could spiral into a headline. A misinterpreted smile could become a scandal. And through all of it, Paul Burrell was the man who ensured that Diana's private life remained as intact as possible, that her voice, her thoughts, and her instincts were never entirely lost to the public eye. It was in this crucible of secrecy and scrutiny that Burrell formed a bond with Diana. He became more than a servant. He became a trusted repository of her fears and her wisdom. He heard her insights about people. Who was genuine, who was manipulative, who could be trusted, and who could not. Diana had an almost uncanny ability to sense the hidden intentions behind even the most charming faces. She was perceptive, cautious, and remarkably candid with those she trusted most. And to Burrell, she confided something that would resonate long after her death: a warning about the kinds of women who could exploit vulnerability, charm, and tragedy to their advantage. She spoke of women who could charm a man into doing their bidding. Burrell would later recount. Women who could isolate someone from his family, manipulate his emotions, and make him feel that he alone was responsible for their happiness. She had seen it before, in her life, and she feared it would happen again, perhaps to her sons. These warnings weren't idle speculation. They were rooted in Diana's lived experience. She had endured a marriage marked by betrayal and political maneuvering, where public perception was carefully curated, and private reality was controlled by those with power and influence. She understood the delicate interplay between love, loyalty, and manipulation, and she wanted Burrell to carry that knowledge forward, to be vigilant, and to observe the next generation with an eye for patterns. Paul Burrell's role was unique because he was both insider and observer. He lived within the palace, but retained a perspective that few others could claim. He saw moments that were private yet pivotal. He witnessed the small tensions that built quietly over time, the decisions that seemed minor but later proved consequential, and the interpersonal dynamics that shaped the family's public and private life. His insights were not guesses. They were drawn from direct observation, from conversations, and from his understanding of the human behavior of those around him. It's important to understand just how intimate Burrell's knowledge of Diana was. He knew her moods, her fears, her joys. He understood her routines, her triggers, and the people she trusted implicitly. When Diana spoke of manipulation, it wasn't an abstract warning. It was a lived reality, a lesson learned through experience. And Burrell internalized these lessons, carrying them forward into the years that followed her death, observing her sons as they navigated adulthood and relationships that the public would eventually scrutinize in unprecedented ways. Paul Burrell had a unique vantage point, one that would later prove essential in understanding the complex dynamics between Harry, William, and Meghan Markle. He knew the princes not just as heirs to the throne, but as human beings shaped by tragedy, privilege, and extraordinary pressure. He knew Harry's vulnerabilities, his impulsive tendencies, his deep sense of loyalty, his compassion, and his desire to love and protect those close to him. And he knew William's strengths and weaknesses, his sense of responsibility, his protective instincts toward family, and his awareness of the pressures that came with their public roles. From this perspective, Burrell could see patterns forming long before anyone else did. He observed interactions, subtle shifts in behavior, and changes in relationships that others might dismiss as minor or inconsequential. But to someone with his experience, these were signals, indicators of underlying forces at work. When Meghan entered Harry's life, Burrell immediately noticed the similarities between her approach and the very patterns Diana had warned about. Imagine being in Burrell's position. You've watched a family endure public scrutiny, private heartbreak, and the pressures of royal expectation. You know the stakes are high. You understand how easily influence can be wielded, and you recognize the subtle signs of manipulation when they appear. And then you see someone new entering the equation, someone whose public persona radiates charm, confidence, and empathy, yet whose actions behind closed doors begin to raise questions. That was Burrell's experience with Meghan Markle. He recalls observing the way she interacted with Harry, the way she influenced conversations, and the decisions she seemed to guide, all while maintaining a carefully curated public image. To the outside world, Meghan was a rising star, a humanitarian, and a loving partner. To Burrell, however, certain patterns mirrored exactly the warnings Diana had given about women who could wield charm and tragedy as tools of control. Burrell didn't speak lightly or recklessly. He had a reputation for discretion, for measured observation, and for speaking only when the evidence was clear. But in this case, the patterns were unmistakable. The dynamics between Harry, William, and Meghan were evolving in ways that mirrored the very cautionary tales Diana had shared with him years before. And the implications were profound. Not just for Harry and William, but for the family as a whole, and for the public's perception of what was happening behind the palace walls. Throughout his time with Diana, Burrell had seen firsthand how secrecy, manipulation, and influence could alter relationships and shape outcomes. He understood the subtle ways that people could be swayed, through empathy, through crisis, through carefully curated vulnerability. And he understood that these patterns, once set in motion, were difficult to reverse. When he saw similar dynamics emerging with Meghan and Harry, he recognized the stakes immediately. But perhaps most compelling of all was Burrell's sense of responsibility. Diana had trusted him with her fears, her secrets, and her insights. And in observing Harry and William, he felt a moral obligation to act, to document, to analyze, and eventually, to reveal the patterns he saw to the world. He wasn't motivated by gossip or spectacle. He was motivated by loyalty, by concern, and by the desire to honor Diana's legacy and her wisdom. His perspective gives us a window into a side of royal life that most people will never see. It's not about the headlines, the interviews, or the public appearances. It's about private interactions, subtle manipulations, and the slow, almost invisible shifts that can redefine relationships over time. And it's from this vantage point that Burrell would eventually expose what he perceives as Meghan's true influence on Harry and, indirectly, on William, a story that is both dramatic and deeply consequential. The stakes were immense. The relationships involved were delicate, and every observation carried weight, because in the world of the palace, perception is everything, and influence can be everything. Paul Burrell's intimate knowledge of Diana, combined with his role as observer and confidant, positioned him uniquely to recognize the warning signs. And what he saw would later form the foundation of the revelations that would shock the public, challenge perceptions, and force everyone to confront the question: what happens when charm, tragedy, and strategy intersect in the life of a prince? By understanding Paul Burrell, his relationship with Diana, his perspective on the royal family, and his keen eye for patterns, we begin to see the story in full. This is the lens through which the unfolding drama with Meghan Markle and the princes can be understood. And it is a story that, if taken seriously, forces us to reconsider everything we think we know about loyalty, manipulation, and influence within one of the world's most famous families.